One shattered bone from 300 yards away, another fit in the palm, and disappeared just as fast. These weren't just weapons, they were fear, discipline, and psychological warfare, forged into iron. The 10 most brutal weapons of the Roman army weren't always the biggest, but they left the deepest scars. Which one didn't need to kill to win? And which made enemies drop their weapons before the first strike? Let's get into it. Forget the sword for a second. Before the gladius ever made headlines, Rome trusted something longer, heavier, and far less forgiving. The hasta wasn't some ceremonial prop. It was 6 to 7 feet of iron-tipped death wielded by the triarii, Rome's most experienced heavy infantry who formed the final line when everything else went to hell. It was basically having senior management step in when the junior staff couldn't close the deal. While other soldiers engaged with gladi at arm's length, hasta-wielding triarii could stab enemies from nearly twice that distance. The iron tip was engineered to punch between shield gaps and find exposed flesh, throats, armpits, anywhere armor couldn't protect you. The hasta was like having a really long, really sharp argument that always won. Roman training emphasized controlled, precise thrusts delivered in perfect formation. This wasn't a weapon for wild swinging. One wrong move, and you'd impale your own comrades. Enemy soldiers who'd fought through 2 Roman lines suddenly faced spear points extending far beyond sword range. Many enemies probably spent their final moments wondering why Romans were so obsessed with backup plans for their backup plans. The hasta was eventually phased out in favor of standardizing around the gladius, but auxiliary forces kept using spear variants for centuries. But when Romans needed precision killing from much greater distances, they developed something far more sophisticated. The scorpio looked like a crossbow that had been hitting the gym and developing serious anger management issues. This compact torsion-powered siege engine could launch armor-piercing bolts over 100 yards with surgical accuracy. It was like having a really mean postal service that delivered packages nobody wanted to receive. What made this weapon terrifying was its simplicity. Operated by just 1 or 2 soldiers, yet delivering killing power that could punch through multiple enemies in a single shot. Roman engineers achieved remarkable accuracy, capable of targeting individual officers from distances that made retaliation impossible. Imagine being an enemy officer and suddenly your aide sprouts a massive bolt from his chest, courtesy of some Roman you can't even see. These weapons were positioned on walls, towers, and strategic battlefield locations specifically to eliminate high-value targets. Enemy commanders, standard bearers, anyone whose death would disrupt organization. The Scorpio crew probably felt like ancient snipers, except their bullets were 3 feet long and came with excellent job security. The knowledge that invisible gunners were methodically hunting leadership created paranoia among enemy ranks. Officers couldn't expose themselves without risking sudden death from unknown positions. But Romans weren't content with stationary artillery. They needed mobile firepower. Roman engineers faced a problem. How do you provide heavy artillery for rapidly advancing legions? Their solution was the carroballista, a wheeled portable ballista pulled by mules that could be repositioned anywhere on the battlefield. It was like a food truck, except instead of serving lunch, it delivered iron bolts to people who definitely hadn't ordered them. The genius lay in combining mobility with devastating firepower. Unlike massive siege engines requiring permanent positions, the carroballista could move with advancing troops and be repositioned mid-battle. Think of it as Rome's first mobile office, except the business was ending lives and customer satisfaction wasn't really a concern. Roman crews could fire iron bolts capable of impaling multiple enemies or switch to incendiary rounds for destroying equipment. Facing a Roman army now meant dealing with heavy artillery that could appear anywhere, at any time, without warning. The carroballista basically turned Roman legions into mobile disaster zones that could set up shop anywhere and start ruining people's day. Traditional defensive positions became meaningless against mobile firepower that could concentrate against weak points or respond to changing battlefield conditions. But sometimes Roman violence required more personal applications. Not every Roman weapon required sophisticated engineering. Sometimes you just needed a wooden club to knock sense into people. The fustis was simple, effective, and thoroughly Roman in its practical brutality. Think of it as performance management, except the performance reviews involved potential skull fractures. Military police, centurions, and guards loved the fustis for its versatility. No complex mechanisms to maintain. Lead or metal reinforcement added crushing power that could shatter ribs or disable limbs without necessarily killing. The fustis was Rome's version of non-lethal force, except non-lethal was more of a guideline than a guarantee. Romans used these weapons for crowd control, disciplinary beatings, riot suppression, and training punishment. Here's what most histories won't admit. Romans used the fustis on their own soldiers as much as on enemies. Military discipline required pain as a teaching method. The fustis made lessons unforgettable, assuming the student survived to remember them. The sound became part of the weapon's psychological impact. That distinctive crack of wood against bone became associated with Roman authority throughout the empire. But sometimes Romans preferred weapons that worked without personal supervision. Imagine the most painful thing you've ever stepped on, then add professional military engineering. Roman caltrops were small, spiked metal devices designed so one point always faced upward, regardless of how they landed. Romans basically invented the world's first passive-aggressive weapon system. The tactical genius was their persistent effectiveness. Scatter these across roads or battlefields, and they'd keep working long after you'd moved on. Cavalry charges ground to a halt as horses stepped on iron spikes. It was like giving the entire enemy army a really bad case of stepping on thumbtacks, except these thumbtacks were designed by people who understood foot anatomy. Each caltrop injury might not kill immediately, but that wasn't the objective. A soldier with a punctured foot becomes a liability requiring medical attention and assistance. One small spike could remove multiple enemies from combat effectiveness. Think of caltrops as Rome's security system that didn't call anyone. It just stabbed intruders and waited for them to notice. War elephants proved especially vulnerable to caltrops, turning these living tanks into limping obstacles that often trampled their own forces while trying to escape the pain. Ready to discover how Romans completely revolutionized their most iconic weapon? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about Roman swords. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. But as Roman enemies adapted with longer weapons, so did Roman swords. By the 3rd century, Roman armies faced different challenges requiring different solutions. The spatha, 28 to 36 inches of steel, became the new Roman standard, replacing the iconic gladius. It was basically the gladius's taller, more athletic cousin who went to better schools. Romans originally borrowed this design from Celtic and Germanic tribes, causing frontier problems with longer weapons. Sometimes the most effective strategy is stealing enemy ideas and improving them with superior engineering. The Romans were like that friend who copies your homework but somehow makes it better and gets a higher grade. The spatha offered greater reach than the gladius, crucial for the looser, more mobile formations that characterized later Roman warfare. The spatha was like upgrading from a flip phone to a smartphone. Same basic function, but suddenly you could handle way more situations. Frontier legions and cavalry units particularly appreciated the spatha's versatility against enemies who'd learned to stay beyond gladius range. Here's what makes this transition fascinating. It demonstrates Roman military pragmatism over tradition. They abandoned their iconic gladius because battlefield effectiveness demanded longer weapons. Speaking of innovation, Romans also experimented with handheld precision weapons. Roman engineers experimented with scaling weapons down as well as up. The manubalista was a compact handheld torsion weapon that functioned like an ancient crossbow, firing metal bolts with enough force to pierce armor. It was like a precision rifle, except it required significantly more upper body strength. Archaeological evidence confirms Romans actually built and deployed these weapons, despite their rarity in historical accounts. This wasn't theoretical engineering. This was practical battlefield experimentation with new forms of violence. Think of the manubalista as Rome's special forces equipment. Rare, expensive, but absolutely devastating when used properly. The tactical applications were specific: sieges where precision shots mattered, ambushes requiring portable firepower, or strikes against high-value targets. Unlike massive siege engines, individual soldiers could carry and operate the manubalista. It was Rome's version of experimental weapons development, except testing happened on actual people during real battles. Roman specialists developed techniques for calculating range, targeting moving enemies, and maximizing penetration against different armor types. This was early battlefield sniping with specialized equipment and dedicated operators. But when Romans wanted to terrorize enemy psychology, they turned to fire. Fire terrifies humans on a fundamental level that bypasses rational thought. Romans weaponized this ancient fear through arrows and projectiles filled with oil, pitch, or sulfur and set ablaze. It was psychological warfare with actual flames, which is way more effective than just talking. Wooden siege towers became death traps when hit with fire arrows. Enemy camps could be reduced to ash from safe distances. Supply lines and equipment could be destroyed without direct engagement. Romans basically turned warfare into the world's most violent barbecue, except nobody was invited to eat. Night raids with incendiary weapons proved particularly effective. Darkness amplified the visual impact of flames, creating panic and confusion among enemy ranks. The chemistry was surprisingly sophisticated. Different mixtures created specific effects: pitch for sustained burning, oil for rapid ignition, sulfur for toxic smoke. Roman engineers became ancient chemists specializing in things that burn really well. Naval warfare saw devastating use of incendiary weapons. Wooden ships covered in pitch were essentially floating funeral pyres waiting for ignition. Sometimes, though, Roman violence became intensely personal. When combat became desperately close and the gladius was too long, Roman soldiers reached for their pugio, 7 to 12 inches of sharp steel worn by nearly every rank as both tool and emergency weapon. It was Rome's backup plan that specialized in stabbing people at uncomfortably close range. The pugio wasn't simply a miniaturized gladius, it was engineered for different scenarios: confined spaces where swords couldn't swing, grappling situations requiring maneuverability, moments when subtlety mattered more than obvious violence. Think of the pugio as Rome's Swiss army knife, except instead of opening bottles, it opened arteries. The pugio's most famous application wasn't battlefield combat, but political assassination. Multiple pugiones ended Julius Caesar's career on the Senate floor. The conspiracy required a weapon easily concealed yet effective at close range. The pugio was basically designed for intimate betrayal. Pugiones also served mundane purposes beyond violence: cutting rope, preparing food, camp maintenance. Roman soldiers used their daggers as tools when they weren't ending lives. The intimate nature created a different psychological dynamic. When someone approached with a pugio, they had to get close enough to smell your breath. For the ultimate expression of Roman engineering violence, they built something truly massive. The onager represented Roman siege warfare pushed to absolute limits: a heavy torsion-powered catapult launching stones weighing 30 to 80 kilograms over 400 meters with devastating accuracy. It was like a wrecking ball that could be precisely aimed from the next neighborhood. The name meant wild donkey in Latin, inspired by the weapon's violent recoil that could injure careless operators. The torsion system used twisted ropes to store tremendous energy, then released it instantaneously with earth-shaking force. Romans essentially built a giant rubber band launcher, except instead of paper clips, it fired boulders that could turn buildings into rubble. These machines systematically demolished enemy fortifications with methodical precision. Walls crumbled under repeated impacts. Towers collapsed into debris. The onager was like having a very patient, very accurate earthquake that only affected your enemies. Roman siege engineers calculated trajectories, adjusted for wind and distance, and placed massive projectiles exactly where maximum structural damage would occur. The sound alone terrorized defenders before the first stone hit. Many sieges ended in surrender before onagers finished their work, which was exactly what Roman commanders preferred: victory without having to clean up too much rubble. If you enjoyed uncovering these brutal truths about Roman warfare, hit that like button and subscribe for more unvarnished history, because the real stories are always more savage than the sanitized versions they teach in school. Now here's the question that's been haunting me. Which of these 10 Roman weapons would you least want to face in battle? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious which one terrifies you the most and why.